when we talk about this kind of text, although there's a number of sort of like structural and narrative things you can say about the plot, from Cambridge's point of view and from the point of view, I think, of an academic perspective, you have to sort of follow your plot knowledge or your just overall knowledge of the book back to sort of trace it back towards what you think Desai's intentions are, what her concerns are. In effect, you have to imagine a writer who has a purpose for writing, really, and there's something that she wanted to communicate about her life experience, essentially about her worldview, and we have to assume that something that takes this form and goes in the direction that it does actually represents what she wanted to say. I mean, you can look at the last page of the book where she thanks her editor and everything, and they spend a lot of time getting it into this exact form, so we're pretty sure that's what she wanted to say. And when it comes to writing this down, you formulate it in statements like, you'd highlight something that happened in the book and say, Desai's intentions here seem to be, or Desai's concerns here could be, or, it seems that the writer wants to emphasise, these types of phrases. And from the Cambridge Exam Board's point of view, this falls under, a lot of these types of statements fall under personal response. In essence, your knowledge of the book, that's up to you. You have to read it and know it. Your ability to analyse, that's perhaps lies in things like pattern recognition, like, well, hold on a minute, this must be a theme because it occurs here, 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 and here. And then your personal response sort of falls into areas where we're essentially theorising about what the writer's intentions are, unless we've got her in a podcast or whatever saying, this is the reason why I did this. So let me go through some of the things that you could cover when you're dealing with responses to, what we believe the writer's sort of intentions or concerns are. I mean, broadly speaking, I think although the book is considered to be sort of post-colonial, dealing with literary and historical social perspectives on India, after independence, after the Second World War, just after Indira Gandhi's been assassinated, in that period where there's a sort of Gorkha uprising, which is sort of ethnic Nepalese people in a little bit of land that's sort of like, when you look at the map, it's sort of like it's a real extension into what would have otherwise been a sort of Nepalese sort of territory. And, have all these characters sort of like living through these sort of socio-political circumstances. And if we focus perhaps in the beginning on Gian and Sai, think about like, what are the author's intentions here? What's she trying to say? Start with Gian. If you look at his character arc, so this is revealed with knowledge from the whole book. It doesn't appear in this order in the story, but it turns out that he comes from a very poor family. It's the type of social situation where the writer says something like, it took like 10 people, generations of people, everyone working together, saving up, sending him to college. So he would be the one who had then enough money to sort of like trickle it back down and then raise up the whole family, which is a common sort of social sort of like strategy in many contexts around the world. Families aiming for sort of social mobility and to get themselves out of poverty, you sort of like raise up one champion. So Jem was their champion, and it's sort of like the highest point sort of like socially he'd achieved in his life was sort of like when he was tutoring Sai. There's some suspicion, at least from that class perspective, that he wasn't that bright, but anyway, that seemed a bit judgmental from them, and he certainly had done enough to do well, in higher education. So he was picked as Sai's tutor, and they have a sort of a romance, which is quite sweet for a while, really, but he very easily falls into the spell, really, of the GNLF propaganda, and he's sort of only exposed to one of their kind of mass demonstrations once, and then he already starts sort of like hating himself and sort of regarding his affection for Sai as being quite effeminate, and sort of feeling like, well, that's distancing himself from that, he starts judging her for sort of Christmas, celebrating Christmas, and things that would be considered to be colonial sort of like legacies. He's now got an ideology that would sort of demonise all of that. So they don't reconcile at all, and all of their interactions are angry after that point. And we realise actually as the book unfolds that the Desai is using a bit of timeline obliqueness or obscurantism, insofar as we realise that the robbery of the guns from the judge's house actually takes place at a certain point in their relationship. We figure that out because Sai confronts him in the village, and she says, she kind of has an intuitive moment. She screams like, you're the one who stole the guns. And then it's reflected in the author's perspective on his internal thoughts later, that he goes over like, why did I do it? And he actually does feel guilty about that. So what's going on with Gian? So as much as you've got some other, I wouldn't exactly call them feminist perspectives, but very clear treatments of injustices towards women in different parts of the book, particularly the judge's wife and so on, who by today's standards is subjected to rape the first time she has sex with her husband, showing how powerless actually she was in that situation. There's certainly a number of those things coming through. But the other side of this is sort of like the male tendency to get in sort of large groups and sort of like go into sort of a mob mentality. And Desai's concerns here, Desai's intention, seems to indicate that when men do this, they tend to lose touch with their sort of like more sort of loving or compassionate or humane nature. Let's say the ability to sort of like form bonds that don't rely on sort of like chanting and like waving, farm implements in the air, like all of that is basically cut off, as soon as you get into that sort of male mob mentality. As a man, I've got one or two questions about that, but that to say what I think her concerns are, that does seem to be what she's saying, really. So, but from Sai's point of view, she experiences the romance as being, having been that character who's reading National Geographic and waiting for everything to happen, just coming to that age where you start to have like a perspective where you're thinking what's out there, what's out there in terms of love as well. Who am I, as a sensual, potentially romantic sort of like girl or, very young woman. And he's sort of like opens the door to that, really. I'm thinking of those two in Frozen now, isn't it? If I can't remember the name, I'll be annoyed now. But Anna, when Anna in Frozen meets that prince who's, not really interested in her, but it's sort of like that moment where she sort of opens up and realises there could be something out there for me. And I think the writer seems to hold that in quite a high regard, really, even though it's sort of trashed. There's no sense where she goes back and regards their interactions as being sort of like worthless. If anything, when you see Sai at the end of the book concluding, her arc concludes with saying, I have to leave, Chooyu, I have to leave the house. And presumably, because we identify Sai largely with the writer, one of my students, class of 2025, pointed out that Sai and Desai is like pretty close. And there's a number of other reasons why we think that the writer, insofar as she's in the book, she kind of looks through Sai's perspective. So, Sai concludes, I must leave this place, which I think is the correct conclusion. But isn't it something to do with that romantic journey and that disappointment and her sort of processing of it? She's aware of everything going on around her. She goes to the library and she picks up a book on sort of ethnicities that had lived in that area prior to the current population. She takes in all that information. She's taking in everything. And I think she concludes that the glimpse of sort of like romance and connection that she's had is partly, anyway, sort of like the catalyst for her conclusion that she has to leave, really. So let's go on to the judge, who's, again, we see him in the present, but we see a lot of him in the past as well, and his again the family sacrifice to send him to England, which at the time was still the colonial power in India, and he gets his degree. He graduates to the Indian Criminal sort of like Service, and he goes around being a judge for a while. He's married, and it's an arranged marriage, which doesn't work out for either of them, and the judge's cruelty is highlighted throughout that relationship. We see him sort of chasing her around, and as I said, forcing himself upon her in their first sexual encounter. There was only one moment where he thought he liked her when they were on the sort of bicycle trip in the village, and when he met her, when he came back on the boat, he saw her, and it was sort of like, oh yeah, I'm married, and after that, he found that his sort of like angry and resentful nature was projected all onto her, really. There's the earlier scene where she steals the sort of powder puff thing, and later on, he's principally angry with her because she goes to meet Nehru, one of the independence political leaders, at a train station, and his superiors say to him, we saw your wife basically siding with the opposition, you've got to deal with her or sort of bring her under control. And then he's so angry, he beats her, he severely beats her, and then sends her back to the village and never sees her again, and she dies tragically. And this timeline, if you look at how this sits, all the chapters where he goes back are interesting if you look at what's happening, as it were, now and then what's happening in the past. So the way Desai does this is she sort of interlaces or cuts between the dog story, where his beloved dog Mutt has gone missing, and this story about him beating up his wife and sending her away. And we can only conclude, really, that Desai's intentions here are to highlight how misplaced the judge's affections are, and that insofar as he couldn't express love outwardly to sort of like his own species, it never went away, and that desire for love and connection remains, really, and it kind of like became kind of like supplanted into this animal that we suppose was a poorer vessel to receive and reciprocate the love. Well, that's not to say that people don't have deep relationships with animals, but let's talk about Desai's perspective. And she seems to believe that his love for the dog was a kind of a projection of everything he could never really express to another person, and then sort of like going into the dog, really. I wonder how we should interpret the fact that the dog is stolen by people who had been wronged in the narrative, and never seen again. The dog was then sold to a family who were interested in the trappings of modernity. Modernity is a theme that comes up for Desai as well. No, I think we need a dog, and not just any dog. We want to breed. It's a red setter, which are they're lovely animals. I suppose that there are a number of dogs around that were just sort of like doing what dogs normally do and just breeding sort of like around, whereas to get a pedigree, we now know you have to do quite a lot of very selective breeding, which is, I understand, not very good for the animal. But anyway, in that sort of context, and in many today, having a pedigree is a status symbol. But this dog was tied up and kicked. I'm dealing with the theme of modernity now, which isn't really tied to any particular character, but it's present in the dog's arc. The dog has an arc, and certainly present in Biju's arc. In fact, the terrifying sort of allure of modernity. I mean, when you think sort of like, why did he go to America? It's partly because the cook, his father, genuinely wanted something better for him. But sort of like, all that glistens isn't gold, right? And like, what was it that was glistening like across the Atlantic to them? And without the sort of propaganda of sort of like modernity, as she calls it, which I think in some senses is another word for capitalism, and consumerism, certainly, that the shallowness or the shadow side of consumerism on modernity, which is are you making a bargain where you give up the actual things that give you roots and value in life. That if you're making that trade, then the thing you end up with, like a dog or a toaster or whatever, won't satisfy you. And this seems to be highly emphasised in Biju's sort of arc, where he comes back to the part of India where his family are, but he can't get there because the GNLF have taken over everything. He has to go in a jeep. He takes them on face value that, okay, they're going to take me back to where my dad is, but they don't. And they put him basically miles away and steal all the things he's bought. There's a huge list of things he buys in the States before he goes back, and they're all sort of like consumer items, as if he could sort of like transport some modernity back to India, as if this would be evidence of having achieved something in life. You might think, and I might think, having a coffee machine is great, but dealing with Desai's perspective, I don't think she does really. There's no indication there at all that wealth or possessions ought to be something pursued. The only time maybe is with the Swiss sort of like dairy farm, where she sort of implies that there was a prospect for some sort of economic or industrial dairy production, which might not be that great in some ways, but it could have been something that added something to the area, and then that was all dismantled. And the guy was deported, wasn't he, for not having the right paperwork. So how did I get to that? Oh yeah, modernity. So I mean the judge and all of those characters that are considered to be the wealthy ones, although the judge's sort of like little estate is decaying, Lola and Nonny, still seem to have enough money to sort of buy Marks and Spencer's underwear and stuff like that. So they've still got a bit of money, but it isn't presented as Desai as being something genuinely desirable. These are things which, to quote, is it T.S. Eliot? These fragments we have shored against our ruin. It's almost as like these sort of like consumer sort of like symbols of prosperity are being like they're a wall that cannot hold. They're constantly collapsing as much as you try and find any meaning in them. Therefore, on modernity, we would conclude that Desai's intentions, or the writer seems to emphasise that a number of characters have a false hope, that modernity, as represented in the sort of accumulation of consumer goods, could be a valid meaning, or provide something, substantial in your life. And according to the writer, that's not the case, not at all. So the judge, we've dealt with Sai, Gian. So Biju we've dealt with to an extent, but the funny thing about him and his arc is that he does come home, although he's advised not to, and his homecoming is fraught with all of the symbols of modernity and his wealth are stripped away from him. And yet the ending of the novel, which I think the very last scene, which we have to consider must be close to the writer's heart, is the reconciliation of Biju and the cook, and the idea that is represented in Sai's perspective, as I recall, that there was some sort of hope there, and the mountains sort of like trembled. They trembled with a genuine connection. They trembled with love. They trembled in the reconciliation of, the Indian working class with the diaspora that had been sent out. They trembled at the reuniting of those two worlds. And, we obviously wouldn't consider that that's an accident. It must be something that the writer was trying to communicate something to us. And I suppose it would be that even in a sort of geopolitical turmoil or a post-colonial border problem, or a genuine economic problem, or having been sort of like fooled by the serpent that, there was something in modernity that you ought to chase, that there's still some hope that love and connection, and roots, still mean something. And that would certainly seem to be the case, that she's arguing that really. Albeit there's displacement, all over the place. I mean, the judge's story also has a huge amount of displacement, in it. He goes to England, then he comes back, and same for Biju, obviously. But there's this idea that there's still, let's say, in India there, which could emerge. Obviously, since the 80s, I mean, it's probably worth saying that I'm certainly not an expert in this, but just a casual observation would be that there have been wave after wave of sort of like renewal and change in every aspect of Indian society, really. Going one way and going the other way, but it's certainly sort of like a story that's carried on. So, I mean, we've talked a bit about the sort of feminist idea now, and I think one of the reasons why the situation of women and their empowerment is genuinely a concern of the writer. There's a number of bits of evidence for this, but I think the principal one is that Sai's very sort of female perspective and concerns are very privileged in the whole book. She is subject to a critique from the author, although the author is broadly identified with Sai. There are times when the author will show you sort of the limitations of her thinking, but more often than not, Sai's the one who sort of figures out a perspective that would be more in line with, something astute or well observed, or something where there might be hope or a critique that's valuable. Often comes from Sai. So you have this sort of female character coming through. I'm not quite subject either to what a lot of the other women are subject to, where the sort of patriarchy, particularly with the judge's wife, is sort of like never gave you a chance, really. I mean, her character seems to be resonant with the deprivation of not being given the opportunity to go around and sort of develop a personal, a genteel response to the world, really. So by the time she gets married, she still doesn't have the confidence to go out of the house, which is again why she's perhaps duped or sort of like tricked into going to see Nehru at the station. And the idea that she would develop sensitive political sensibilities. Virginia Woolf would have told you, well, that's not going to happen by chance. You have to actually be given, space physically, geographically, but also politically, socially, educationally, and all those other ways to actually participate in that world. And then what happens? You're being hammered over the head and judged for not knowing these things. Well, how could you ever know them? Sai's not really subject to errors on that level, and therefore she's sort of a force for an emerging kind of like femaleness, which perhaps, according to the writer, is something that could potentially counterbalance out the toxic mob maleness, which is something that she seems to dislike more than everything else in the book, really. In Sai's journey, which we presume that she does leave Cho Oyu, seems to be full of the possibility that she'll leave and discover more of her own agency, since she's the one who's picking up information and understanding more than other characters as she goes through. Our hope's really in her, and the final hope, mentioned in the book, which is sort of her perception of, we have power cuts here, the power's either come on or gone off, and her final hope, seems to be something that the writer sort of like gifts her with, and the reader sort of like then leaves her with as she goes potentially out into the world. So contrast that with Gian. So although they worked together for a while, the last thing we hear of Gian is his completely empty promise, I will bring your dog back, don't worry. And the Desai comments just after that there was nothing really in what he was saying, it wasn't linked to any genuine intention, this sort of intensity. And let's think about this. So she doesn't even conclude that. She never even comes back and says, oh yeah, and by the way, Gian never brought the dog back. It's such genius when you think about it, like sort of like judging by omission, or judging by a lack. It is of course a lack, and the lack. So he is in the end, according to the writer treats him as a highly vacuous individual. Not completely condemned in his own thoughts. He does reflect to an extent, but even at the end of the book, he's making completely empty promises. And although Sai hopes it's him when she sees the figure sort of like coming over the hill, and it's not, it's Biju. That's the end of that. The last thing we hear is that her hope in Gian is unfulfilled, and that's certainly what the writer, I think, leaves us with. That if you're, so I would say, if the writer was going to tell us in her own words, she'd be saying something like this: that if you're male and you're still caught up in sort of like male mob sort of like scenarios, where you use force to disrupt things, then you're not part of the solution. That genuinely seems to be what she would say. There's obviously, the post-colonial theme is huge, and it covers a number of characters, but I think one of the places where it's most clearly seen is in the cook's mentation. So the writer gives us very clear pictures of the cook's thoughts, really, his mentation, like what he reflects on. The climax of his character arc, coinciding with the judge's violence at the end, is really very, very moving, where the cook comes in and basically says, beat me, I've done you wrong. And he admits that he has, in the course of his employment, fiddled the books, eaten rice that he shouldn't have. And all of these crimes, amount to, here and elsewhere in the book, amount to the fact that he has internalised not only the local version of the Indian caste system or class, let's say class system, because actually the writer doesn't go into caste, I don't believe, but certainly the class system. And not only that he's completely internalised the colonial class system. There's the colonial hierarchy of, like, who's got, who are the ones that are the best and can be trusted and all those things. And there's a point where it's pointed out to him on an inflatable globe that the sunlight hits India before it hits America, and he has to sort of struggle to comprehend this, because America ought to be first in everything, and he has that sort of cognitive dissonance, which Biju actually experiences as well a lot. In sort of like meeting. When he meets Saeed, he's kind of like, I have to make an exception for this guy because he doesn't fit into my category. When you see these characters who sort of have internalised a sort of disenfranchising version of the world, really. Oh, well, of course you've put me at the bottom of the hierarchy, and then that becomes sort of like an embodied and lived out way of thinking, which, from the author's perspective, I find it quite remarkable, her treatment of these very difficult issues, because when you look at her voice, it doesn't go into a high level of judgmentalism about these things. She remains with a kind of a distance that suggests that she would understand this, and she would wish that this ought not to be, but she doesn't hold the characters in contempt, really. So it's sort of like that observation, like the writer in many cases points out how characters have internalized colonial values, especially the judge as well, and also Lola and Noni, with their preference for sort of like Marks and Spencers and all that stuff. It's clear that there's a lasting, from the writer's perspective, there's a lasting sense that Indian society has now internalised a colonial value system that it's going to find hard to escape. The privileging of English is another example of that, and that can be seen in a number of post-colonial contexts. They're not primarily post-colonial, and I don't like using that word because it's sort of like, it's as if they're still, sort of like trapped in that past, really. But from a certain perspective, the use of English, as a medium of instructions in schools, and the character's privileging of English, from Desai's point of view, seems to be a hangover of that, really. this thing of like, policing, sort of self-policing. Like now I've internalized it. I'm going to be the one to cause violence to myself or to my interest group. Seems to be a concern of Desai. That the idea is that once you've downloaded that system, you don't have to actually have lots of policemen out there. This is almost a Foucauldian idea, really, where once you've ingrained the idea of surveillance, let's say, then the individuals surveil themselves. So what's the evidence? So the cook sort of like turning himself in, you've got to beat me up, please beat me. And the judge, being who he is, he's like, okay, I will beat you. He starts hitting him over the head, which is sort of like tragic. But of course, with all of this writing, there's just this slight sense of humour and absurdity that somehow redeems it as well, I think. So people who have been tainted with the sort of like racial hierarchy ideas of colonialism, self-policing, but also women are self-policing. If you look at like who's looking on in some of the worst moments for women, especially the rape scene, you've got this sort of almost biblical thing where, who was it? It says like the Pharisees were looking on, or the Sadducees were looking on. It's like all the aunties were looking on, sort of like, it wouldn't have been like that in my day. You just had to sort of like, as if they, because of how they'd suffered, they were then policing against other women to say, you have to basically put up with what we have, violence from men essentially, and if you don't, you've betrayed us. So the writers seems to be concerned here to illustrate that there's sort of like a double problem here. The initial sort of inculcation of a worldview that actually places you at a disadvantage, and then the self-policing of it, which I think is it's an incredible work. It's unbelievable how much is in here, and that is a point that's very well made. I think made in an unforgettable way. Class, postcolonial, immigration, displacement. So I think that's most of what I wanted to say, really. There's a number of things you could say about narrative methods, which would certainly ultimately surface as the writer's concerns. I'll just cover a few of them now. That's not my principal aim, but so what could be the writer's purpose in having so many multiple viewpoints? And that's really revealed in Sai's comment at the end, where she says something like she could no longer hold on to the idea that her life would be one simple narrative that was about her. And I think that's evidence in the writer, really, that she now has a perspectival view of sort of society, really. One of the things about postmodern and potentially metamodern literature is that there's some of the hope that comes out of what seems to be a fragmentation is that there could be sort of like these fragments could be reunited, and after all, if we didn't know how a certain disadvantaged group was suffering, and once we do know and we can line those up with all the other voices that we know of, we've got a better chance of producing equity or justice in the world, if that's our aim. And that to some extent seems to be Sai's aim, and she carries some of the sort of ethical hopes really forward, and her understanding that life was not going to be simple, but that she would have to take in all these other viewpoints. It seems to be not devoid of hope. Given that the writer's gone to great lengths to set up all of these points of view sort of like cutting into each other, and yet there's two agencies here capable of providing a synthesis or a sort of central point of understanding of all those, and the Sai emerges as the third. The first point of sort of like omniscience, as it were, is the writer, obviously, who, given her ability to sort of orchestrate and deploy these different perspectives, at the same time as they're being fragmented, she's also implying that her viewpoint is the one that gives them sort of like a coherence. And she's then inviting the reader to sort of come into that coherence. Like, can you figure out, how all these things fit together? Can you deal with cutting of timelines and different characters' perspectives? And I think, like, why would she be inviting you into that? I propose that her concern here is that the reader comes to the same conclusion that Sai has. This is it's my own opinion, but I would write this down in an A level or an undergrad paper. That she's inviting the reader to go on the same journey that Sai has, in order to enter into the understanding that you will get to a deeper truth if you take in multiple viewpoints, even contradictory viewpoints. So what are some of the contradictions? Well, don't we think Sai deserves to have a life? Don't we think India deserves to have a post-colonial era free of strife? Don't we think the Gorkhas might have been disenfranchised? It's sort of like, but they're all, aren't they mutually exclusive interests? Don't we think the writers, if they would just want to celebrate Christmas, do we really have to go all Marxist on them and sort of like rip that out of their, their sort of like social world? But don't we think that it's also, don't we want an India to arise that, if necessary, breaks free of any sort of like unnecessary colonial legacies which act as limitations? And we say yes, 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 yes. And although in some ways it's sort of like, well, how's that going to happen? Isn't the coherence of the author and the coherence of Sai and the coherence that she invites the reader into, isn't that a type of hope, that there could be some reconciliation here? We have to point out, obviously, that there's no resolution at all to the Gorkhaland storyline in the book, and that's left hanging. I mean, we obviously check the history books, and we find that the uprising didn't result in an independence, or that becoming part of a greater sort of Nepal in de facto sense, as perhaps Kosovo becomes, although it's independent, it's in some sense very closely linked with Albania. That didn't really happen there. So open-ended but hopeful, but not underestimating the severity of the problem. And I think genuinely a moving piece of work, really. So, I mean, I've covered a few things there. If you've got any exams coming up with this, good luck. And if any of my class of 2025 got to the end of the video, good luck to you too.